Today I have the honor and pleasure of interviewing Tom Scanlon. Tom, a little later we'll get into some of the details of your life and work, life of public service and many things that you've done for the common good and for social justice. But I'd like to begin with some of your principles, your motives. What has really moved you to get involved in different efforts for the common good?
I guess I'd mention several things. One, of course, would be the formation I had at a Jesuit high school in Scranton, Pennsylvania. And the other, of course, would be my years at Notre Dame, where I was greatly influenced by Father Theodore Hesburgh. I was one of the lucky ones to be one of the first persons to be able to join the Peace Corps. And when I joined the Peace Corps, I was a graduate student in philosophy, thinking that I'd be a university professor. But when I had the opportunity to serve in Chile and got involved with international development problems, I decided I'd like to have a career in international development and international affairs.
What was it about your Jesuit education in high school and also your education at Notre Dame that really moved you to get involved in these kinds of things?
Well, even I had mentioned to you the other day that in the 50s, and I don't know if it's still today in Jesuit high schools, there was a sodality movement. It was based on the spiritual exercises of Saint Ignatius, and we had a very active sodality at Scranton Prep, and we did all kinds of apostolates in the poorer sections of town, working in orphanages. So in high school, we had many apostolate. We used to call them apostolates.
Mhm.
And at Notre Dame, we actually, a group of us from St. Louis and Kansas City and Philadelphia and Chicago, who had been part of the Jesuit sodality movement, we tried to start a sodality at Notre Dame. And we were able to come up with something like that. But Notre Dame, I was chairman of the service organization at Notre Dame called the Blue Circle. And so the Peace Corps was an extension of that somewhat. I was also greatly influenced by Thomas Dooley, who was a medical doctor, graduated from St. Louis Medical School, but he had studied at Notre Dame, and he went on to work with refugees leaving North Vietnam and serving refugees throughout Southeast Asia. When I graduated from Notre Dame, I was very much interested in becoming a college professor. And so I had studied in the Great Books program and with an emphasis on Middle Ages and so on. So I went up to live at St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto and studied at the Pontifical Institute there, where I studied for my master's degree. Um, but that was interrupted in because I remember walking around Toronto in the winter of 1961, right after John Kennedy's inauguration, and thinking I really would like to do something more action oriented rather than just philosophy. So that on March 1st, John Kennedy announced the creation of the Peace Corps. And I called my parents that day and said, this is what I want to do. And they supported me. So actually I was invited to serve with the first group ever to go overseas that went to Ghana. But Father Hesburgh at Notre Dame was organizing a group to go to Chile. So he wanted me to go with him. And so in the fall of 61, I went with the first group of Peace Corps volunteers ever to go out to Chile.
Recently, I heard a story of a young Peace Corpsman named Tom Scanlon who's working in Chile. He works in a village about 40 miles from an Indian village, which prides itself on being communist. The village is up a long winding road which Scanlon has gone on several occasions to see the chief. Each time the chief avoided seeing him. And finally he saw him and said, "You're not going to talk us out of being communist." And Scanlon said, "I'm not trying to do that, only to talk to you about how I can help." And the chief looked at him and replied, "In a few weeks, the snow will come. Then you'll have to park your Jeep 20 miles from here and come through 5 feet of snow on foot. The communists are willing to do that. Are you?" And when a friend saw Scanlon recently and asked him what he was doing, he said, "I'm waiting for the snow." Well, I hope that spirit motivates all of you.
And came back in 63, and then I got my degree in international relations from Columbia University. So then I did a number of things that were kind of some successful, some unsuccessful. And when I was in my 20s, David Brooks calls them the Odyssey years. So they were very much the Odyssey years for me. I spent some years in Mexico and made good friends there. And then finally, in 1969, came back to Washington, began just doing some work, selling my time piecemeal, hour by hour, day by day. And in 1970, I incorporated the consulting operation, which is now 49 years old. So I've been able to live by my wits for 49 years. I've had some wonderful clients. Been to China many times, working for a university in China, which has set up a center to teach about the United States and foster China-U.S. good friendship relations, and that's a real challenge these days. And I also did work for the Peace Corps and for the Agency for International Development. Was able to work with the food aid program for many, many years on contract, the Food for Peace program. And my other clients have included a Catholic university in Mexico, the University of Monterrey, and several corporations in Mexico, which for me it's an honor to be their Washington rep. So I've done one job for the last 49 years.
And I noticed on your website and in some articles that you worked to prevent aid from going to the dictatorship of Pinochet in Chile. Was that kind of an outgrowth of your experience there? You were particularly concerned about Chile and you felt that the U.S. should not be supporting that brutal dictatorship after the coup of 1973.
This is one of the most important things I ever did in my life. And it was not only because of my connection with Chile, it was because of my connection with Father Hesburgh at Notre Dame. Notre Dame had arranged our group to go to Chile, and in 1976, Cardinal Enrique Silva from Chile asked Father Hesburgh's help in getting support for the Academy of Christian Humanism. That was an academy that was trying to create jobs for the professors that were having to leave the state universities and have to, or to leave the country. There was a terrific brain drain from Chile during the Pinochet years. So Father Hesburgh asked me, this is a long story, I'll make it short.
Okay.
Father Hesburgh asked me to help him, and we did research showing that the Inter-American Development Bank was about to give $8 million to the Pinochet government. And we went to the Congress and got the Congress to write Agency for International Development, actually Dandy Fasel, who was chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and we stopped that. And not only did we stop that, but we stopped money going to Argentina and Brazil, who also in those days had military dictatorships. And so we fought that for many years, and finally, all of that money and that fund at the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, went to the Inter-American Foundation, which supported human rights and civil society and human development projects throughout Latin America. So I think of all the things that I've ever done in my life, that might be the most important. And we had Pinochet very mad at us.
Oh, I'll bet. Well, good. He's the type of person we want to get mad at
By the way,
us. So, Tom, were you actually in Chile when you were investigating that situation?
No, that was all done in Washington because that's where the money was.
Yeah.
And actually, it was a very sensitive subject for Pinochet. In fact, his people had just assassinated Letelier at Sheridan Circle. And so this was a few months after that. You know, we had to go out. I would go out and look under my car every morning before getting into it. But one episode we did have, Father Hesburgh and I met in New York during this period. We had dinner at a restaurant. About a month later, a person at the Inter-American Development Bank that we were working with, Fernando Molina, came up to me and was very concerned because he had been shown a report showing that the DINA, which was the secret police of Chile, had been observing Father Hesburgh and I and following us around in New York City. But we knew we were dealing with the Congress, and we didn't think, we knew that if anything happened to us, the Congress would know where to go. So.
Right. Very good. That's very, very effective solidarity to prevent U.S. aid from regimes like that, which are very oppressive and brutal toward their own people. Maybe you could go into a little bit, Tom, the action that you took, the way you helped to elevate your beloved Peace Corps from a position of some unimportance that it had fallen into under the Nixon administration.
And this is a bureaucratic story and a political story. And of course, President Nixon was elected in 1968. And, beware of the bureaucrats when they try to reorganize things, okay? So the Office of Management and Budget was then called the Bureau of the Budget. decided that they should consolidate all the volunteer programs into one massive organization called Action. And the Peace Corps had it's still on a honeymoon, they say, 50 years later. The Peace Corps was very popular. It had its ability to have its own press office, and it had an excellent public relations division. And all of that was buried into this large bureaucracy. For 10 years, the Peace Corps was not able to have a piece of stationery with the word Peace Corps on it. It was the assistant, the assistant division of action for international affairs or something like that. So Sergeant Shriver and but I testified 10 years in a row before Fulbright and before Senator Ribicoff of the Senate subcommittee on executive reorganization, saying that this was just a bureaucratic nightmare for the Peace Corps. And then finally, in 1980, thanks to Ronald Reagan and to a wonderful Peace Corps director that he named, Lorette Ruppy, a woman from Michigan, the Peace Corps was restored to its independence, and it made a big difference.
Let me ask you about your friendship and cooperation, collaboration with Father Hesburgh. How did he inspire you? He as a good priest, as a priest really involved in work for the poor and for justice.
He inspired every Notre Dame student, and in a way every Catholic. His work with the Civil Rights Commission in the late 50s, which which resulted in a report which was the basis for the Voter Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. Father Hesburgh was a great friend of ours. He married us. He baptized Garrett, who got married yesterday.
Yes.
And I was just fortunate to be like a person in Washington that when he came to Washington, he would call in and sometimes even ask for my help with things. And one thing also about Father Hesburgh, we kid, of course, the famous joke, the difference between God and Father Hesburgh is that God is everywhere, and Father Hesburgh is everywhere but Notre Dame. Okay?
Oh.
So
That's pretty good.
in the years that I was in the Peace Corps, I saw him probably more than in the years that I was at Notre Dame, because he loved this Peace Corps group so much. And they were atheists and Jewish members and Protestants. They all became very close to Father Ted. In fact, in 2011, we had a 50th anniversary. He was there, even though he was in his mid-90s. And so, because of my double association with Notre Dame and that Peace Corps group that went to Peace Corps in September of 1961, we were blessed, my wife and I, to have had a lot of wonderful times and inspiration from Father Hesburgh.
Tom, how do you see all your work for justice and in solidarity, very effective solidarity with people in need, as coming out of your love of God, your love of Christ, your Christian motivation? How is that? Why should people as Christians be involved in that kind of thing, especially in the struggle for justice and social change?
Well, I'll go back to the words of Father Joe in yesterday's wedding ceremony, talking about loving your neighbor and the readings that we had. And I mean, there's nothing more central to the Christian message than concern for others.
Right. Okay, where we find Christ in others, because that's what.
And I try to think of that every morning. Faith knows that. The first 15 minutes of the ride to work is always just asking God that I can be of service to my clients, to my family, and to others.
Now, many Christians are involved in helping others, usually in an individual way or helping small groups. but you've been involved, as I have, and many others, in struggling in many ways for change of policies, social change, structural change. How do you see that as an outgrowth of your Christian commitment?
Well, I mean, part of your education is the study of political structures, and it's a pretty easy step from trying to understand what's going on in your country or in other countries between that and your Christian formation. And so I agree with you. Of course, Father, you're more of a model of that than I am as far as committing yourself to social justice causes. But but one of the things that I think I've really enjoyed most in my career was being associated with the Food for Peace program, which has been used by Catholic Relief and by the Adventists and the Seventh Day Adventists and a lot of religious groups all around the world. And they're the impact of that charity is just not charitable, but it's also trying to foster democratic development and justice.
What would you say to young people today? I know you gave that talk at the commencement of high school. What do you say to young people today about the meaning of life, or what kind of wonderful future they would have, what they should choose, what type of work and life they should choose to follow?
Well, let's go back to your original question about being a person for others. And I think you should be a person, an international citizen. It's impossible not to be concerned about not just our country, but about others. And of course, we have examples of that today in Central America and Mexico and on our border. So to be aware of international problems and your citizenship, and also a lot of younger people coming out of college today will come and ask me for guidance, or their parents ask me to talk to them because they want to have a career in international development. It's become a very popular field, and for good reason.
And when did you have the good fortune and the great blessing of meeting and marrying Faith?
Actually, Faith was involved with the Carter administration. She was the deputy press secretary to the First Lady. Traveled with her to refugee camps in Cambodia, or at least to Latin America, but helped organize her trips to Southeast Asia. And so Faith and I met in 1977 in April, and we had a wonderful time together in Washington, and got married. Father Hesburgh married us several years later. I was very fortunate in the early 70s, 1970s, to be asked by the widow of Charles Marsh to serve on the board of the Public Welfare Foundation. The Public Welfare Foundation was started by her husband, Charles Marsh, who was one of the first supporters financially. He was a very wealthy man of Lyndon Johnson and helping him to become elected member of Congress and senator in Texas. And he was a very, very idiosyncratic man. He left us $20 million, which over the next 40 years, while I served as director for 40 years and chairman as 10, grew to be $500 million.
$500 million.
Yeah, and we went from 20 million in assets to 20 million a year in grants.
Wow.
And I'll mention three things I'm most proud of. We gave the first grant ever to the Washington office on Latin America with Joe L. We were one of the first groups ever to give support to the Vietnam veterans that won the Nobel Peace Prize for their work against landmines. In the late 1970s, and this is very relevant today, with the number of refugees leaving Southeast Asia, we created a group in the United States called that welcomed and helped settle Southeast Asian refugees in the United States. And finally, in the 80s and the 90s, we were one of the first groups ever to really provide funding for anti-hate groups. So refugees, hate are certainly topics that are very relevant today. But I'm proud to say that we were pioneers in trying to help in those areas. So that was a great experience of mine. It was a volunteer experience, so we didn't get paid for that. And that was 40 years.
That's wonderful, wonderful work. Was that at the beginning of WOLA?
We gave them the first grant they ever got.
Okay.
Joe Eldridge
Yes, I know Joe.
and Bob Brown came by to see me in the office. Oh, and those days, and this was a unique foundation because it wasn't staff dominated. The board could really have ideas about what to do, and so I'm the one who took Joe to the board, and we got him $100,000.
Wow. But the initial money for the Public Welfare Foundation, where did that come from?
Charles Marsh owned newspapers.
Oh.
He owned newspapers all over Texas and Florida, and he died without a penny. He left of course, he left his wife very well, okay, but he gave the entire, all of his money, all his newspapers. In fact, the foundation for the first, 15 years that I was on the board, we actually managed 3 newspapers. They were the source of our income. So that was service, I guess, too. And it was started by Bob Greenstein, and it was a reaction in the early, I've said something nice about Ronald Reagan, but also in the early 80s, there was a big push to reduce funds being spent on poverty programs. And there was a big push to make sure that there was an accurate description of the budget in terms of its impact on the poor. And so the Public Welfare Foundation and the Field Foundation went together to create the Center on Budget Priorities, which has become enormous today and has state affiliates, and it's always been an advocate and a source of solid information about the impact that government programs have or don't have on poor populations. Well, it's too bad this video doesn't include a section on my wife's work with the First Lady and her work in Southeast Asia and Latin America and promoting services for the mentally disabled, and the wonderful work that Jimmy Carter and the Carter administration did for human rights around the world. One of the things that was most satisfying about our work in Chile was that it all started with a request from Cardinal Silva to Father Hesburgh for help to try to get funding for his various projects, including the Academy for Christian Humanism, to keep scholars and to take on the Pinochet regime. So it was a request for money, for help.
Well, he had the Vicariate of Solidarity.
Yes.
Right? It was a human rights organization.
After it was all over, 5 years after we started, Father Hesburgh and I have actually a list of over $5 million in project support that went to the Cardinal from the funds that we kept from going to Pinochet.
Oh.
But to the right people in Chile.
Right. Oh,
And that was, and the Cardinal was very happy about that. One last story about the Cardinal. So about 20 years later, he was retired, and I went to see him because I was in Chile, actually with visiting with Mrs. Clinton in the 90s. And I went to see him, and he was in his late 80s or mid 80s, and I asked him, I said, Cardinal Silva, what are you doing? He said, I'm counseling high school students. That's my vocation.
Wow.
He had been Cardinal of
Wonderful,
Chile,
yeah.
but he loved working with high school
Well,
students.
he found something directly pastoral and interesting and important to do in his latter years.